The city at night had a certain kind of electricity, a hum that was different from the daytime rush. It was the sound of things winding down and other things just getting started. The Uptown Grill was a small island of light in that late-night sea. Its windows were always fogged up, and the neon sign out front buzzed like a trapped fly. But inside, it was warm and smelled of old coffee, frying oil, and something sweet like pie. She moved through that warmth like a ghost. A quiet woman, hair pulled back in a simple, practical way, her face showing the tiredness of the hour she kept. She wore the uniform, a pale blue shirt with a small, embroidered name tag that most people never read, and a dark apron that was a map of her night. A smudge of ketchup, a splash of soda, a dusting of powdered sugar. Her hands were interesting. They were slender, but they looked strong. There was a faint, stubborn blue stain near her cuticles, like ink that wouldn't wash away. Most of the people who came to the Uptown Grill at this hour weren't looking for fine dining. They were looking for a place to land. There were tired cab drivers shoveling down eggs, couples after a movie sharing a slice of cheesecake, and students with textbooks spread out next to cold cups of coffee. And then there were the others, the ones who brought the noise of their day, or their night, in with them. Tonight, it was a group of 4 young men in crisp, slightly rumpled dress shirts. They'd come from some office building, or maybe a bar, their voices loud and sharp with the kind of energy that comes from a deal closed or a bonus promised. They filled a corner booth with their laughter, which was a little too loud, and their jokes, which were a little too cutting. She served them with a quiet efficiency. She brought their burgers and beers, refilled their waters, and answered their overly friendly questions with short, polite smiles that didn't reach her eyes. They called her sweetheart and darling in a way that felt less like a term of endearment and more like they were reminding her of her place. She let it slide off her back, the way you learn to do when you work with the public. Her real focus seemed to be on the rhythm of the diner, the hiss of the grill, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of other conversations. In the far corner of the room, mostly ignored, stood the piano. It was an old upright, the color of its wood a dark, scarred brown. One of its front legs was slightly shorter than the others, so it leaned a little, giving it a slumped, tired look. The top was littered with flyers for local bands, a couple of forgotten coffee mugs, and a small, sad-looking plastic plant. No one had played it in years, not seriously. It was just part of the furniture, a relic from a time when the grill might have dreamed of being a jazz club. The young men, their confidence boosted by their beers, noticed it too. One of them, the one with the loudest laugh and the most expensive watch, pointed a finger. "Hey, check it out." "A piano? You think it actually works?" His friend, a guy with close-cropped hair, snorted. "Doubt it. Probably full of cockroaches and old dreams." They all laughed. Their eyes scanned the room and landed on her as she was wiping down an empty table nearby. The one with the watch got a gleam in his eye. It was the look of someone about to turn a person into a punchline for the entertainment of his friends. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out. The diner's other noises seemed to quiet for a second. A couple at the counter glanced over. The night manager, a balding man named Ray, who was counting receipts by the register, looked up with a worried frown. She stopped wiping and turned slowly towards them, her expression neutral, waiting. "You know how to play that thing?" The man asked, his voice dripping with fake curiosity. He gestured grandly towards the piano, like a game show host, presenting a prize. She just shook her head slightly, a small, non-committal movement, and went back to wiping the table, but he wasn't done. He dug into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He slapped it down on the sticky table with a snap that made everyone jump. "Come on, I'll make it worth your while. Give us a tune. Something lively." He winked at his friends, who were now grinning, leaning forward, enjoying the show. The air in the diner thickened. This wasn't a request anymore. It was a dare. A performance ordered up like another round of fries. The other customers had stopped their own conversations. The student looked up from her books, annoyed. The older couple by the window looked uncomfortable. She stood very still, the damp cloth held tight in her stained hand. Her eyes went from the $20 bill a day's worth of tips for some people, to the smirking face of the man who offered it, and then to the old, silent piano in the corner. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing something heavy, something invisible to the rest of them. Ray, the manager, cleared his throat. "Leave her alone, guys. She's working. You want more coffee?" But the man waved him off, his eyes locked on her. "What's the matter? Stage fright?" The mockery in his voice was plain now. It wasn't about the music. It was about power. It was about making the quiet waitress dance for their amusement. Something in her face changed then. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a decision. A quiet, solid settling, like a door closing softly, but firmly inside her. The nervous ghost of a woman faded away, replaced by someone who looked suddenly deeply calm. She didn't look at the men again. She didn't look at Ray. She simply placed the cleaning cloth down on the table, folded it neatly with a slow, deliberate motion, and then she began to walk. She didn't walk towards their table to take the money. She walked past it, her sensible shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. She walked straight towards the forgotten piano in the corner. Every eye in the uptown grill followed her. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic outside. When she reached the piano, she didn't sit right away. She ran her fingertips, the ones with the ink stains, lightly along the edge of the scarred wood. It was a touch that looked almost tender. Then she carefully lifted the flyers and the dead plant off the top and set them on a nearby chair. She pulled out the piano stool, which gave a faint creak of protest. And then she sat. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, just breathing. The four young men were silent now, watching, their smirks frozen in place, unsure of where this was going. The man who had started it all shifted in his seat, the $20 bill suddenly seeming very small and silly on the table. She lifted the fallboard, revealing a set of keys that were yellowed with age and a little dusty. She didn't look at the audience she hadn't asked for. She looked only at the keys. She stretched her fingers, and for the first time, everyone could see how long and capable they were, how the tremor of wiping tables was completely gone. She placed them gently on the ivory, and the room held its breath. The first note she played wasn't loud. It was a single, deep, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate in the silence, surprising everyone, including her, as if the old instrument had just been waiting for the right touch to remember its voice. It hung in the air, full of promise, and in that moment, the Uptown Grill was no longer just a diner. It had become a stage, and she was about to own it. The sound of that first chord was like a key turning in a long locked door. It was deep and round, a little dusty maybe, but true. It didn't come from the tinny, beaten-up box everyone saw. It seemed to come up from the floorboards, through the soles of her shoes, and out into the quiet air of the diner. It surprised her as much as anyone. Her shoulders, which had been a tight line of tension, dropped just a fraction. For a few seconds after the chord faded, there was absolute silence. The kind of quiet where you can hear the buzz of the neon sign outside, the distant hiss-pop of the grill in the kitchen where the cook had stopped to listen. The man who had tossed the $20 bill had his mouth slightly open, his joke stalled halfway to his lips. His friends weren't grinning anymore. They were just watching, caught off guard. Her hands didn't leave the keys. They settled. The ink stain on her right thumb was a small blue shadow against the yellowed ivory. She took a slow breath, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, not seeing the cracked vinyl of the booth across from her, not seeing the mocking men at all. She was somewhere else. She began to play, Dot. It wasn't a song anyone in the diner knew. Not at first. It started low and slow, a wandering, thoughtful line with her left hand. It was bluesy, but a complicated, sad kind of blues. It sounded like a rainy night in the city, like watching taillights disappear down a wet street. Her right hand joined in, tracing delicate, sparkling notes above the melody, like drops of water on a window pane. There was nothing clumsy or hesitant about it. Each note was placed with a certainty that felt ancient, like she was remembering something her bones knew how to do. The young men in the booth exchanged a look. This wasn't the clumsy chopsticks or a shaky nursery rhyme they'd expected. This was real. This was music. The one with the close-cropped hair leaned back against the booth, his arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed, but his foot had started tapping a slow, steady rhythm on the floor, almost against his will. She wasn't playing for them. That became clear. She played like she was the only person in the room. Her face, usually so careful and blank, had changed. A faint line of concentration appeared between her eyebrows. Sometimes her eyes would close for a few bars, and her head would give a slight nod, as if she was listening to a voice only she could hear inside the music. The tired waitress was gone. In her place was someone completely focused, completely in charge. The melody began to shift and grow. It picked up speed, turning into something quicker, more playful. Her fingers flew now, dancing over the keys. It was jazz, but it had a wild, joyful heart to it. A smile, a real one, tiny and private, touched the corner of her mouth for just a second. The old piano responded to her touch, the hammers hitting strings that hadn't been struck with such purpose in years. It wasn't a perfect concert hall sound. It had a slight honky-tonk twang, a rattle in the bass notes, but in that room, it sounded honest. It sounded alive. Over at the counter, the night manager had stopped pretending to count receipts. He was just leaning on his elbows, watching her. He'd seen her mop floors and handle drunk customers and count out her tips with tired eyes. He'd hired her because she was quiet and reliable and never complained about the late hours. He knew she sometimes sat at that piano on her break, but she always played so softly he could barely hear it, and he'd never really paid attention. Now he was seeing a stranger. A feeling was growing in his chest, a mix of awe and a strange sense of guilt, as if he'd been storing a priceless painting in the broom closet. The older couple by the window had turned their chairs completely around. The woman had reached over and taken her husband's hand. They weren't rich people. Their coats were worn at the cuffs, but they sat perfectly still, listening. The music seemed to be pulling memories out of them, painting pictures in the greasy air. The man gave his wife's hand a gentle squeeze. The student had closed her textbook. She rested her chin in her hands, her eyes wide behind her glasses. She was studying engineering, all numbers and logic. But this was a different kind of math. This was beauty built out of thin air and old wood and those flying, stained fingers. It felt important. Back at the booth, the dynamic had broken. The loud one, the ringleader, had picked up his beer bottle but hadn't taken a drink. He was just holding it, his thumb rubbing against the condensation. The smirk was long gone. His face was unreadable. The $20 bill lay between the ketchup bottle and the salt shaker, looking more and more like what it was, a cheap trick. He felt a hot prickling at the back of his neck, a feeling he wasn't used to. It was shame. His friend, the quieter one who had been mostly watching, finally whispered, "She's incredible." No one argued. The music built to a peak, a cascade of notes that tumbled over each other like a waterfall, and then suddenly she pulled it back. Just like that, It returned to that slow, rainy night blues from the beginning. But it was different now. It was richer, sadder, like the story had been told, and this was the quiet ache of remembering. She let the final notes hang in the air, one after the other, until there was just a single, sustained bass note humming softly into silence. Her hands came to rest, palms down on the keys. She sat there for a long moment, her head bowed, coming back to the room, to the smell of old coffee and fries, to the weight of all those eyes on her. The spell was fragile. No one wanted to be the first to break it by clapping or speaking. It was as if a soap bubble, beautiful and perfect, hung in the middle of the diner, and a single sound would pop at Dot. It was the cook who broke the silence. He pushed through the swinging kitchen door, wiping his hands on a towel. He was a big man with a tattoo on his forearm and a usually grumpy expression. He just stood in the doorway, looked at her at the piano, and gave a slow, single nod. Then he turned and went back into the kitchen. The door swung shut with a soft humped Dot that broke the tension. A wave of applause started, not wild and cheering, but deep and respectful. It came from the older couple, from the student, from a cab driver in the corner who had come in halfway through and stayed by the door to listen. It was genuine from the gut. She flinched at the sound, as if it startled her. She quickly, almost shyly, closed the fallboard over the keys, hiding them away. She stood up from the stool, and as she did, she seemed to shrink back into herself. The commanding presence evaporated. She was just the waitress again in her stained apron, her face carefully arranging itself back into that neutral, polite mask. She didn't look at the applauding customers. Her eyes went straight to the booth. The 4 men were clapping too, but theirs was slower, more hesitant. The loud one met her gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes. No, I told you so. There was just a quiet, deep exhaustion, and something else a challenge, maybe. A simple, unspoken question. Asterisk, do you see now? Asterisk, he looked away first, down at the table, at that stupid $20 bill. When he looked back up, she was already walking. Not towards their booth, but towards the hallway that led to the restrooms and the back door, needing a minute alone in the quiet dark to let the echo of the music leave her, to become the person who had to refill the coffee pots again. The stage was empty, but everyone in the Uptown Grill knew they had witnessed something they would never forget, and nothing in the little diner would ever feel quite the same again. The hallway behind the diner was short and dark, smelling of old mop water and lemon cleaner. She pushed through the heavy back door and stepped out into the night air. It was cool and sharp, a relief after the stuffy warmth inside. The alley was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters, the brick walls stained with years of city grime. A single flickering security light cast long, dancing shadows. She leaned against the cold brick, closing her eyes, and let out a long, shaky breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. Her hands, which had felt so sure and powerful on the keys, were trembling now. She held them up, watching them shake in the dim light. The ink stain was a familiar smudge. For a few minutes in there, she'd forgotten about it. She'd forgotten about the coffee stains on her apron, the ache in her feet, the hollow feeling in her stomach that was part hunger, part something else. She'd just been the music. The door creaked open behind her, and she stiffened, quickly wiping her hands on her apron as if caught doing something wrong. It was the night manager. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the light from the diner. He didn't say anything for a moment, just held out a chipped mug of steaming water with a tea bag string dangling over the side. "Thought you might need this," he said. His voice softer than usual. She took it, muttering a quiet thanks. Her fingers wrapped around the warmth, trying to steady themselves. He stepped out into the alley with her, leaving the door open a crack. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket, offering her one out of habit. She shook her head. He lit his own, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his tired face. "So," he said, blowing smoke away from her, "that happened." She just stared into her tea, watching the dark color bleed from the bag. "I gotta ask," he continued, his tone cautious, not prying, just curious. "Where on earth did you learn to play like that? I mean, that wasn't just piano lessons after school." She was silent for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer. The sounds of the city filtered into the alley. A distant siren, the rumble of a truck. Finally, she spoke, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. There was a school. A music school. A really good one. She said it like it was a fact about someone else, a character in a book she'd read long ago. "I went there. For years." He nodded slowly, taking it in. "A prodigy, huh?" She gave a small, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "No, not a prodigy. Just dedicated. Worked harder than anyone. My teacher said I had the hands for it, and the ear. But not the other thing." She took a sip of the hot tea, wincing slightly. "The thing that lets you get up in front of 1,000 people in a fancy hall and not feel like you're going to be sick. The thing that lets you make music a job instead of just a need." The manager listened. He was good at that. In his job, you heard a lot of stories, most of them half told over coffee at 3 a.m. "Stage fright?" he asked gently. "It wasn't just fright," she said, her eyes distant. "It was like my own body would turn against me. My heart would pound so loud I couldn't hear the piano. My hands would sweat so much they'd slip off the keys. Once during a big jury exam, I just froze. My mind went completely blank. I just sat there in front of all those professors for what felt like an hour until someone finally came and led me off the stage." She shrugged, a small, defeated movement. "You can't have a career like that. The pressure, it just got worse. Every time. So I left. And you ended up here," he said, not as a judgment, just a statement. "I ended up here," she echoed. "Needed to pay rent. Needed to do something where the only thing I had to not drop was a plate of eggs." She looked at him then, her eyes finally meeting his. "The piano. I asked you if I could keep it. Remember, when I started? You said it was just junk taking up space." He remembered. She was the quiet new hire, barely speaking. She'd pointed to the old upright and asked, so softly, if it could stay. He'd shrugged and said sure, it was too heavy to move anyway. "You play it on your breaks," he said, understanding dawning. "When the place is empty? I've heard little bits sometimes." "Thought it was the radio." She nodded. "It's the only time I can play, when no one is really listening, when it's just for me. It's the only way it still feels. Good, like it used to, before all the panic." She looked down at her hands again. "Tonight? Those guys? I just got so tired of being small. For a second, I just wanted to not be the joke." "Well," the manager said, stubbing out his cigarette on the brick wall, "you sure showed them. They looked like they saw a ghost." A faint, real smile touched her lips for the first time. They paid for their bill. The loud one left the 20 on the table. "He didn't look at me when he left." "He left it for you?" the manager said. She shook her head firmly. "No, it wasn't for the music. It was for the show he thought he was ordering. Put it in the tip jar for everyone." They stood in comfortable silence for a minute. The sound of the diner was a quiet murmur through the open door. It sounded different now. The usual clatter was underscored by a low buzz of conversation. People were talking about what they'd seen. "They're all asking about you in there," the manager said, nodding his head towards the door. "The older couple wants to know if you give lessons. The kid with the books asked if you have anything recorded." She immediately shook her head, a flicker of the old panic crossing her face. No, no lessons, no recordings. This was a one-time thing, a mistake, almost. Did it feel like a mistake? He asked, watching her closely. She thought about it. She thought about the moment her fingers found that first chord, the way the noise in her own head had just stopped, the way the worn keys felt like home. No, she admitted quietly. Playing didn't feel like a mistake. Everything after did. He pushed himself off the wall. Well, come on back in when you're ready. The coffee pots aren't going to refill themselves. And, for what it's worth. He paused in the doorway. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in this place. And I've been here 20 years. He went back inside, leaving her alone again with the alley and the tea, and the trembling in her hands that was finally starting to settle. When she walked back into the diner a few minutes later, it felt like walking onto a stage again, but a different kind. Every customer looked up as she passed. Their looks weren't mocking or curious anymore. They were looks of respect, of awe. It was almost worse. It was a pressure of a different kind. She went straight to the coffee station, her head down, and started the familiar, mechanical task of brewing a fresh pot. The Loud Group's booth was empty, cleaned off. A $20 bill was gone from the table. She saw it, folded neatly, stuck into the shared tip jar by the register. She felt a small knot in her stomach, loosened out, as she carried the fresh pot around to refill cups. People spoke to her differently. "That was just wonderful, dear," the older woman said, patting her hand. "What was that last piece you played?" The student asked, her engineering notebook forgotten dot. She answered with short, polite phrases. "Thank you. Just something I remembered." She kept moving, using the work as a shield. Then she reached the counter where the cab driver sat. He was a big man with a kind, weathered face. He sipped his coffee as she poured. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I drive all night. I hear a lot of things on the radio. Talk, music, all of it. But what you played," he shook his head, "that came from somewhere real. You can't fake that." He looked at her, his eyes knowing. "Don't let the bastards get you down. And don't you dare stop playing." He said it not like a request, but like an order from someone who'd seen too much of the world to mince words. Then he went back to his coffee, leaving her holding the pot, feeling something warm and solid settle in her chest, where before there had only been a hollow, shaky fear. She finished her round and went back behind the counter. The night manager caught her eye and gave her that same slow, acknowledging nod. The cook banged a plate down on the service window and called out, "Order up," in his usual gruff voice. The diner was slowly returning to normal, but it wasn't normal. And she knew, as she picked up a plate of fries and a club sandwich to deliver to table 5, that it never would be again. The piano sat quietly in the corner, its fallboard closed. But it wasn't just furniture anymore. It was a presence. And she had, for 5 minutes, remembered who she was when she sat in front of it. The memory was terrifying. And it was the most alive she'd felt in years. The next few nights at the Uptown Grill had a strange, quiet charge to them. The air felt different, like after a thunderstorm has passed, but the ground is still wet, and the leaves are turned upside down. People who came in looked at the piano in the corner first, then scanned the room for her. She kept her head down, did her work, and the piano stayed closed. It was like a truce had been declared between her and the old instrument, both remembering what happened, both pretending it hadn't. But the world has a way of not letting things lie. Started with the student. She came back 2 nights later, not with her engineering books, but with a friend. They ordered pie and coffee and sat in the same booth, their heads close together, talking in low, excited voices. They kept glancing at the piano and at the waitress refilling the sugar jars. Finally, as she was clearing their plates, the student spoke up, her voice respectful but firm. "Excuse me? We were wondering. Would you consider playing something tonight? Just one song?" My friend here didn't believe me when I told her. She froze, the plates suddenly heavy in her hands. The old, familiar feeling began to rise in her chest, a tight, cold fist closing around her lungs. She shook her head, a quick, sharp movement. "I'm sorry. I'm working, and it's not really that kind of place." She hurried away to the kitchen, her heart thumping. The student and her friend looked disappointed, but they didn't push it. They left a good tip and a small folded note on the table that read, "Thank you for the other night." That should have been the end of it, but at WASN, single quotes T, that the older couple came back on Friday. They brought another couple, friends of theirs. "We told them about the concert." The woman said, her eyes bright, "We just had to bring them to hear you." She gave them her polite, tight smile and said, "I'm just on waitressing duty tonight. I'm afraid." She could see the disappointment cloud their faces, a different, gentler kind of pressure than the mockery, but pressure all the same. Then, on Sunday night, he came back, the loud one, the one with the expensive watch. He came alone. He didn't sit in a booth. He took a stool at the counter, right in her section. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of apple pie. He didn't look at her with a smirk. He didn't make a joke. He just sat there, stirring his coffee slowly, looking like a man with something on his mind. She avoided him as long as she could, letting the night manager take his order. But when his pie was ready, the manager nodded at her. "Plates up. He's asking for you." Her hands felt cold. She picked up the plate, the pie wedge wobbling slightly, and walked over. She set it down in front of him without a word, already turning to go. "Wait," he said. His voice wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, almost rough. She stopped, her back to him, bracing herself. I owe you an apology," he said to her back. She turned slowly. He wasn't looking at her face. He was staring into his coffee cup as if the words were written there. "The other night, me and my buddies, we were out of line. Way out of line. We were being jerks. I was being a jerk." She didn't say anything. She just waited, her arms crossed over her apron. He finally looked up. His face was serious, no trace of the cocky grin. "That thing you did, with the piano. I've never heard anything like that. Not in some fancy club, not anywhere. It was humbling." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out his wallet. This time, he took out $100 bill. He held it out to her. "This isn't for a show. It's for the art, and for being an idiot." She looked at the money, then back at his face. The anger she'd been holding on to since that night didn't melt away, but it shifted. It wasn't a hot anger anymore. It was a heavy, sad understanding. He was just a guy in a world that rewarded being loud, who had never been taught to look for beauty in quiet places. Until it had screamed at him in the key of Gershwin. "Put it in the tip jar," she said, her voice flat. "It goes to everyone." He hesitated, then nodded, folding the bill and sliding it into the jar on the counter. He took a bite of his pie, but it seemed like he'd lost his appetite. "My sister," he said after a minute, surprising her. "She's a cellist. Really good. She practices all the time. I used to tease her about it, call it a hobby." He shook his head. "I called her after that night, told her what happened. She said what you did, playing like that in a place like this, after what we said. That took more guts than any concert hall." He stood up, leaving most of the pie uneaten. He put cash on the counter for his bill. "I won't bother you again, but thanks for the lesson." And he left, the bell on the door jingling softly behind him. She stood there for a long minute, cleaning the same spot on the counter with a damp cloth. The night manager came over, picking up the 100 from the jar and whistling low. He's been in here 3 times looking for you. You know, left when you weren't on shift. Think he really meant it. I know, she said softly. The manager leaned on the counter. Look, he began, his tone careful. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But this thing, it's not going away. People are talking. A guy came in yesterday asking if we had live music weekends. He'd heard from a cabbie. He paused. What if? And just hear me out. What if we tried something? Not a big deal, just 1 night a week. For 1 hour. You play that piano. We'll call it something stupid like Friday Night Notes or whatever. No pressure. If one person shows up to listen, fine. If it's just you and me and the cook, also fine. You stop whenever you want. The panic flared, bright and immediate. No, I can't. You know I can't. The shaking, I can't do it with people expecting it. What if they're not expecting a performance? He asked. What if they're just in the room while you play? Like the other night, after those guys left. The people who stayed weren't a crowd. They were just folks in a diner who got a gift. She thought of the cab driver's words. Don't you dare stop playing. She thought of the student's note. She thought of the loud man's apology and his sister the cellist. I'll think about it, she said. Which wasn't a yes, but it was the first time in years it wasn't an immediate. Terrified, no doubt the idea sat between them for the rest of the week. It was a quiet, persistent hum in the background of the coffee machines and sizzling burgers. She found herself looking at the piano differently. It wasn't a monster or a sanctuary. It was just a piano. A beat-up old thing that made sound when you touched it. On Thursday night, during her break, she didn't go out to the alley. She walked over to the piano. She didn't sit down. She just lifted the fallboard. In the quiet, empty diner, she pressed a single key. Middle C. It rang out, clear and a little lonely. She sat down. She didn't play a song. She just played chords, slowly, letting them fill the empty space. She imagined the diner not as a stage, but as it was right now, chairs on tables, floors mopped, a single light over the counter. She played for that empty room. And it was okay. Her hands were steady. The next night was Friday. The diner was busy, the usual end-of-week crowd. She worked her tables, aware of a new kind of buzzing energy. The older couple was there. The student was back with 2 friends. The night manager had put a small, handwritten sign on the piano that simply said, Music at 10. No one said anything to her about it. But at 5 minutes to 10, she saw people finishing their meals a little slower. Orders for dessert were placed. Coffee cups were refilled. A small group of people she didn't recognize, who had heard the whispers around the city, came in and took a booth near the back. The panic started to rise, a cold wave in her stomach. She ducked into the narrow hallway, breathing hard. The night manager found her there. You don't have to, he said simply. I know, she whispered. It's just an hour. Or 10 minutes. Or 1 song. Or walk right past it and start wiping tables. It's your call. She looked past him, through the kitchen window, at the cook. He was plating up a burger. He saw her looking, gave a sharp nod, and went back to his work. No big deal. She thought about playing for an empty room. She thought about the difference between being watched and being heard. At 10:05, she walked out of the hallway. She didn't walk like she was going to a showdown. She walked like she was going to do a task, like refilling the ketchup bottles. She went to the piano, sat down, and opened the fallboard. Every eye in the place was on her. Her throat went dry. Her fingers felt stiff. This was it. This was the feeling that had ended everything. She closed her eyes. She didn't see them. She listened. She heard the clink of a fork, the low murmur of the refrigerator, the distant traffic. She placed her hands on the keys, the ink stain a familiar landmark, and instead of the fierce, show-stopping jazz from the other night, she began to play something slow and gentle and old. A lullaby. It was so soft that at first, people had to lean in to hear it. It was music for a quiet room, not a cheering crowd. And as she played, something let go. The tightness in her chest loosened just a little. The fear was still there, but it was sitting next to her now, not choking her. She was playing, and people were listening, and the world hadn't ended. She played for 20 minutes. Nothing flashy. Just honest, simple music that filled the diner with warmth. When she finished the last gentle chord and looked up, the people were smiling. They gave soft, appreciative applause. Not the roaring awe of the first night, but something better. Something that felt like gratitude and community. She gave a small, quick nod, closed the piano, and went back to work, picking up a coffee pot. Her hands didn't shake. Not even a little. The waitress had touched the piano, and for the first time, she hadn't just owned the stage. She had shared it. And it felt, surprisingly, okay. Change, especially the good kind, doesn't usually come with a bang. It comes quietly, like the sun rising. You don't notice it at first, and then one day you look around and the dark is gone. That's how it was at the Uptown Grill. Friday nights became something else. They didn't put a fancy name on it. The handwritten sign just stayed up on the piano. Music at 10. Some weeks, it was just a handful of people, the regulars, who now planned their late pie and coffee around it. Other weeks, word would spread, and every booth would be full, with a few people even standing respectfully by the door. But it never felt like a concert. It felt like you were just lucky to be in the diner at the right time. She never made a big deal about it. At 5 to 10, she'd finish taking an order or clearing a table. She'd wash her hands at the service sink, sometimes scrubbing at that old ink stain that never fully left. She'd take off her apron and hang it on a hook behind the counter. Then she'd walk to the piano, sit down, and play. The music changed, too. It wasn't always the stormy, powerful pieces she'd played that first night. Some nights it was soft, melancholic tunes that matched the rain on the windows. Some nights it was upbeat old songs that had the cook humming along from the kitchen. She started taking requests, but only if they were whispered to her beforehand, and if she knew them. She'd give a small nod, and when the time came, she'd weave that song into her hour, making it her own. The piano itself seemed to get happier, its tone warming up, the rattle in the bass note slowly disappearing as it was played with care, week after week. She still waited tables. She still took orders, dealt with picky eaters, and mopped up spills. But the dynamic had shifted forever. The customers who came for the music treated her with a gentle reverence. The ones who didn't know would sometimes ask the regulars, "Is she a famous pianist or something?" And the regulars would just smile and say, "Just listen." One Friday, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a notebook came in alone. She sat through the entire hour, not touching her slice of cheesecake, just listening, her eyes closed part of the time. After the music ended and the waitress had put her apron back on, the woman approached her at the counter. "I run a small community music school," the woman said, her voice low and earnest, "for kids who can't afford big lessons. We don't have much funding, but we have heart. I was wondering if you ever had any interest in teaching, even just a workshop. The way you connect with the instrument. It's not just technique. You could show them that." The old fear, the one about stages and expectations, flickered for a second. But this was different. This wasn't about performing. This was about passing something on. She thought of the student with the engineering books, of the loud man's sister, the cellist. "I don't know how to teach," she said honestly. "You just did," the woman said, gesturing to the room. "For an hour. You taught everyone here how to listen." She left a card on the counter. "No pressure. Just think about it." The card sat by the coffee machine for a week. She'd look at it while refilling pots. One morning, before her shift, she picked it up and put it in her wallet. The biggest surprise came from the cook. He was a man of few words, his communication mostly a series of grunts and the sharp slap of food on the pass-through window. One Thursday afternoon, during the slow lull between lunch and dinner, she was setting tables when she heard it. A slow, clumsy, but unmistakable melody coming from the piano. It was Chopsticks. She peeked around the corner. There he was, the big cook with his meaty, scarred fingers, carefully pressing 2 keys at a time, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't see her. He messed up, cursed under his breath, and started again from the beginning. She didn't say anything. She just went back to folding napkins, a small private smile on her face. The next day, she left a simple beginner's piano book, one she'd picked up from a thrift store years ago, on top of the piano. She opened it to the first page. When she came in for her evening shift, the book was gone from the piano and was now sitting on a shelf in the kitchen, next to his spice rack. Life settled into this new rhythm. The diner was her anchor. The piano was no longer a secret or a rebellion. It was just a part of her life again, a part she shared. The shaking hands that had defined her failure now only happened on very rare bad days. Most of the time, they were just hand strong, capable hands that could carry 3 plates of food or bring a Brahms intermezzo to life. One unusually warm Friday night, almost a year to the day after the first incident, the diner was packed. The buzz was louder than usual. She didn't think much of it until she finished her last.